I'm Deacon Ed Schoner from the Diocese of Scranton, and I'm going to we'll start our webinar. This is a second one of that we hopefully will be a continuing monthly series of webinars that we'll put on with the Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers. The idea is to build a network and to also share ideas as we come up with ideas that we see other people in the ministry implementing and bringing into practice in their ministry. We'll share that more broadly with other folks that are involved with the association and interested in this ministry. So this topic, mental health ministry as a pro-life ministry, to be honest, it was not something that occurred to me until I got a call a couple months ago from Lauren Stadelman and Mike Donaldson from the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, who are involved with the Lauren's group is called Caring for the Whole Person. It's part of the Office of Life, Justice, and Peace with the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And I'll get into it a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but their One Life LA March, which is basically their pro-life event around January 22nd, the traditional day when pro-life marches occur, revolving around the Roe v. Wade decision day. They contacted me and asked me to participate in the One Life event. And maybe it's obvious to many of you, but it wasn't obvious to me that mental life ministry is an important part of pro-life. So that's why I thought it'd be a good idea to share this idea of how mental health ministry is in fact a pro-life ministry and should be an integral part of what we do is in pro-life activities. So there'll be two of us presenting today, myself, and I'll be talking briefly about including mental health ministry activities in pro-life events. And I'll give the example of LA and a couple other dioceses where this has been taking place. And then also joining me and be giving a much more extensive presentation than me is Sharon St. Pierre. She's a clinical director for New Hope Counseling and recently joined the Catholic Charities in Orange, California. And she'll be talking about how mental health ministry can support and be involved in the pro-life activities by supporting particularly folks after an abortion and pregnancy loss. Many of us in this ministry have a heart for accompanying people and being with people, and supporting people after abortion and pregnancy loss is an important part of something I think many of us might want to incorporate into our mental health ministry, at least an aspect of it. And Sharon used to also work for the Diocese of Los Angeles and worked with a ministry called Merciful Companions, which is basically lay people that are trained to accompany people after who have experienced an abortion and pregnancy loss and the trauma associated with that. So Sharon will talk quite a bit more about the aspects of that ministry. So let me reflect for a couple minutes on how mental health ministry is in fact pro-life ministry. As you can see there, the quote from John Paul II, I think is probably something all of us as Catholics might be fairly familiar with, that all human life from the moment of conception and through all subsequent stages is sacred, because human life is created in the image and likeness of God. And that's the basis for us Catholics across the United States participating in these life events, that basic core belief. And pro-life is not only about the unborn, but all stages of life. And we need to recognize the dignity of human life through all stages, from birth to natural death, but also in between. And I think that's why there's parallels between the pro-life movement and mental health ministry, because sadly, all too often, the unborn are devalued as human beings. And sadly, at times, those people that live with a mental illness, we can be similarly devalued. And there's parallels. I have a couple quotes here from Pope St. John Paul II that sort of brings into focus the parallel between those two experiences. When he was in New York City in 1995, this is a quote from a homily he gave at that time, specifically addressing us Americans. As followers of Christ, we must be committed to the defense of life in all its stages and every condition because of the assault on human life, particularly unborn life, in the United States through our abortion laws. But also similarly, Pope St. John Paul II also saw the folks that suffer from mental illness. We need to be reminded they also have the inalienable right to be considered as an image of God in a person and be treated as such, because sometimes the folks with mental illnesses can be discarded, and we can kind of just see them not as a person, but we just see them as their illness. We see them as a schizophrenic or someone with bipolar or as a depressive, and we forget that they were in fact made in the image and likeness of God. So there are these parallels there that I think are worth considering as we integrate our ministry into the pro-life ministries. I also got a little bit wonky, so to speak, and took a look at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' pastoral plan for pro-life activities. And there's a section in there called A Consistent Ethic of Life, where they reflect a little bit on the issue of taking care of human life through all stages. A consistent ethic of life is the phrase that they use. And a wide spectrum of issues touch on pro-life and human life and the promotion of human dignity. We can't tolerate bias and discrimination, which all too often folks with mental illness, we use the word stigma quite often, which is an accurate word, but also sometimes it goes beyond that and it does tip over into outright discrimination. And realizing that all human life is sacred at every stage of life, both unborn and also throughout the totality of our lives. And among important issues involving the dignity of human life, abortion plays a central role, particularly in areas where the unborn life is in peril, such as it is in the United States. And it's important that we give attention and priority to this issue. But the focus of the Church's commitment to is a consistent ethical life where it complements one another. So the abortion, of course, is a central characteristic of our pro-life activities, but taking care of folks in other stages of life is also complements that pro-life philosophy within the Church. So it makes a lot of sense to tie in mental health ministry into pro-life activities. Let's see, I'm trying to get to the next image here. There we go, Kate. There we go. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what brought this to my attention, at least, was the One Life activities in Los Angeles, where they called, and to be honest with you, I was a little bit surprised that I was asked to be on it because of the nature of my ministry is not directly related to abortion and unborn life. But as you can see there, this is the page from their web page, and Kate just put up the link to this page. It was just this past weekend, and the mission of One Life LA is, of course, a march to life, but it's also it unites communities, inspires positive actions that promotes the beauty and dignity of human life from conception to natural death. And then, as you can see there on the bottom, the community resources were pro-life work, of course, but also homelessness, trafficking, environment, the disabled, immigration, and mental health was factored into all of this, which is a beautiful way to integrate all of these ministries into the pro-life ministry. And you can see there on the right the images of the different speakers. And there was a youth and young adult session. Then we all went on a walk from the historic LA Park down to another park in LA. Well, I guess the large park is the historic park in LA. And it was a quick event. There was a number of speakers, and I think it's not so much what we said, but just merely the fact that we were there spoke a lot about the consistency of value of life from beginning to end. So in addition to myself speaking about mental health and mental illness, Sister Norma Pimentel, pretty well known in Catholic world, and I think even beyond that, spoke about migration and the issues on the border. Chris Duffy spoke about, who lives with physical disabilities, spoke about the importance of that, and including folks who live with these disabilities into the life of the Church. Gloria Purvis spoke about racial issues and also life issues, and Marie and Sister Bethany also spoke about life issues and their particular ministries revolving around that. So like I said, I think it's not so much what we said, but just merely the fact that we were on the stage and talking about our ministries was an important statement to the folks that attended. Just briefly, what I talked about, there's a quote from the National Catholic Register, an article in the Register about why I was invited and about how the harmony, this message of mental health ministries is in harmony with the pro-life walk messages. It's about celebrating the value and dignity of human life from conception to natural death. And I concluded the talk by saying, if you're struggling with a mental illness, know this: your pain is real, but so is hope. Christ never abandons you. You are never alone. Christ sees your beauty. Christ sees your dignity, the dignity of all human life, even folks that live with mental illnesses. We need to always remember that and reassure them that they have great dignity. So a couple other ministries that have been involved with this. I don't know if it's coming up there, Kate. It's coming up just a little bit on mine, from the Diocese of Joliet. I hope the other folks can see it. Yep.
Back.
There we go. Yeah, the Diocese of Joliet, their office of Dr. Valerie Matty from the Office of Family Ministry, and also the Respect Life Ministry integrated mental health ministry into their ministries. And you can see here they are part of a community education topic, abortion and mental health webinar this past October. So they're integrating these two ministries together, which is good to see. And also in the Diocese of Rapid City, their ministry of I hope the image is coming up better, Kate. The image on my screen is a little mixed. There we go. The Diocese of Rapid City also integrated, who has a grant from our association to support their mental health ministry through the University of San Diego. They've integrated and used some of you may have heard of the Rachel's Vineyard Ministry, which provides very good support and help to people that are recovering after the trauma of an abortion, and providing them with the support they need. And the other aspect of this ministry, of course, is advocacy for better policies, particularly for people that live with a mental illness, and the fact that mental illness itself can terminate all too often in suicide. About 48,000 people a year die from suicide in this country, and if today's a typical day, sadly about 125 people will die from suicide today. And I think that particularly that quote up in the upper right hand from Dr. Knock from Harvard University, people find this statistic surprising, but the suicide rate today is about the same as it was about 100 years ago. It's gone up and down a bit over the years, but it still stays the same. And I think that's because of the stigma and discrimination and the unwillingness of the broader society to address this issue of suicide, and to do the research and find the root causes of it and bring these suicide rates down. So besides our ministry can accompany people and support them, also there's a role in there, just like in the pro-life movement. A lot of effort goes into advocacy. There's room for advocacy within the mental health ministry too, to advocate for better care in the broader society. And if there's any doubt about our being tied in a little bit into the pro-life ministry, this is my first experience in getting censored by Facebook. But if you can see on the left there, we wanted to put up an ad about, we weren't going to spend a lot of money, but, a couple $100 perhaps, broadcasting our little webinar here today on Facebook. But apparently, because of the connection to pro-life, apparently we got rejected. So I'm glad you all came to this ministry through the email and other ways. You can see the rejection notices we got there from Facebook. So I guess we're officially part of the pro-life movement now, because we also are getting rejected by Facebook in our ability to try to more broadly advertise the availability of this webinar and how mental health ministry is part of the pro-life movement. So that was my first experience of something like that. So I'll turn it over to you, Sharon, now to talk a little bit about how we can more directly care for people who are suffering from these abortion
Thank you so much,
reproductive
Deacon
losses.
Ed. It's such a privilege to be with all of you today and just share a little bit about my experience in not only working with Catholic Charities of Orange County as the clinical director, but having developed that merciful companion model for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And this was over 6-7 years ago. And where I had the capacity, because I'm a licensed clinical social worker, to integrate the knowledge that I have regarding grief and the stigma of mental health in order to train lay people to begin to walk alongside those who are ready to start healing from their wounds of a pregnancy loss. I know you already know this information, but I think it's important to put it into context as we understand the impact of a pregnancy loss with mental health, that there's people that are struggling, that are people in one way or another. It may be traumatic or it may not. Regardless, there are wounds that need to be healed. The relationship with God has been impaired. We know that very clearly, being Catholics. And regardless of the denomination that folks have that come our way, ours has to be a stance of understanding and a stance of compassion. Those are two very important key words, not only in the language that we use with folks we come across, but in having a sense of curiosity to learn about the stories that they come. Because it's not about what's wrong with you or how did you do this? Why would you have an abortion? Why would you keep getting pregnant if you're having so many miscarriages? That's all judgmental, right? It's about having a compassionate stance to understand the story behind each individual. But we see with this, the stats that I'm showing you here, there's, you know, this 1 million elective abortions are performed each year. 1 in 80 pregnancies will end in stillbirth. 1 in 4 pregnancies will end in miscarriage. I throw in the stat of infertility because we often don't consider that as a difficult moment in our life or something that can contribute to mental health, where the evidence is that indeed it can impact one's mental health. But also very important, one of the things that I want you to walk away from today is that although the natural tendency is to focus on the woman, we cannot neglect that men are equally impacted. And alongside with men, there's this expansion of relatives, immediate family, co-workers, you know, friends and people that we know that as they find out about our story or loss can equally be impacted. So the help for those wounded by a pregnancy loss is not exclusive to the woman. So let's try to think outside that box to understand that anyone, including siblings that later in life learn to find out about an abortion, for example, can be impacted, not necessarily in a traumatic way, but if it can create a certain impairment in some way or capacity. A study that was done by supportafterabortion.com, which is a national organization, came out with the result that 9 out of 10 people do not know where to go for help, which to me is very shocking, but it's part of the reality of the stigma that surrounds wanting to heal from a pregnancy loss. And that's the beauty of lay ministries such as this one, where you can come and take charge of building the necessary bridge to connect with those folks and open the doors to welcome these stories to be told. Because it's not about, you know, a counseling magic wand of any sort. There's no fixing to a situation of grief and loss. It's about understanding and it's about compassion. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I think it's important to reiterate and validate the importance of those skills. So knowing that we have this strong prevalence of the impact of mental health, let me play with this. Here we go. Understand that there's several possibilities of how one's mental health can be impacted by a pregnancy loss. And pregnancy loss is the big umbrella, right? So we know that the different circumstances of loss are different: abortion, miscarriage, stillbirth, and so on. But what joins them are the common thread of the possibility of these different mental health conditions. So anxiety, big also umbrella word that can be manifested in different ways. It doesn't mean that they need to meet the full diagnostic criteria. As lay ministers, that's not what we're going to look for, but we're definitely going to listen to words such as difficulty sleeping, not being able to concentrate, being worried if my, future husband will judge me because of my abortion, questioning myself and my sense of paternity, knowing that I'm infertile, who is going to love me, things of that sort that can follow within that level of anxiety. Depression is another very big common word that we hear, and often that's manifested through a lot of feelings of sadness, right? And feelings of hopelessness. And a lot of these things are going to overlap. But again, the role of a lay minister is not to diagnose someone, but to understand if they're presenting with these big labels per se, to understand that it falls within the result of having a pregnancy loss. And I myself experienced a miscarriage between baby number 1 and number 2. And I can tell you that I manifested a lot of these different symptoms, but I didn't meet the full criteria of a depression. A lot of it was my natural grief over the loss of a child that I wanted. Complicated grief is often what is seen as well. What do I mean by that? Well, there's no timing for grief, although we like to say that, you know, in 6 months, one should feel better, or after 3 years, one should feel better. That's really a myth. Grief is such an individual, unique process for people. But complicated grief is a result where the day-to-day functioning of the individual is now being impacted, where the sense of helplessness and hopelessness for, you know, this reproductive story per se that went awry is not being manifested, and I don't know what to do with it. And the same can happen with the ability of not knowing how to cope well, that may turn an individual into coping through an eating disorder, okay, or coping through substance abuse. And you're probably all familiar with why that would happen. A lot of it has to do with that sense of disconnect, that sense of loneliness that individuals feel when they're faced with the pregnancy loss. There's a lot of misinformation, a lot of lack of education that doctors and people in the medical field have that don't always communicate a sense of empathy or a sense of this is what's going to happen or could happen to you on an emotional level. So as lay ministers and even as clinicians, a lot of times we're inheriting this, I don't know what to do, is this within the norm? So a common statement that we hear in this ministry is, am I going crazy? Is it okay for me to cry over a decision that I made to abort my baby because my financial situation or because my partner was having mental health issues himself or herself, and I just couldn't do it? Okay. A lot of that is very common, and something that's always going to be very important, again, is that active listening that I'll talk a little bit about. But, you know, just to give you a general idea, there's going to be different intensities and different timeframes for when people experience this. And if you ever decide to log into a website where people are given the opportunity to share their testimonies, you're going to see that there's a lot of people who were on the verge of suicidality, for example. Their depression got to a higher level. That complicated grief got to a higher level. Folks who turned to substance abuse. I remember clearly a college student years ago when I got started with this ministry. She was drinking NyQuil and she was consuming alcohol because all she wanted to do was to numb herself so that she wouldn't feel. So a natural reaction that you're going to hear in stories like this are that of avoiding and wanting to ignore what happened, whether it was miscarriage, whether it was the reality of that stillbirth, or whether it was the reality of the abortion. But as much as we see that in women, we have to recognize that we also see it in men. And I'm happy to learn that there's more and more research that is coming out in terms of how men are being impacted. And a study done in 2019 that I make reference here for your knowledge and information talked about how men were coping with a miscarriage. And it was interesting to me to receive validation because having worked with men, I noticed these different metaphors that would come up in terms of how they were impacted, how their response felt like the child lost through the miscarriage was a lost gift, that the process that they were going through felt like a cataclysm, that they were trying to grieve the death of a loved one that they didn't yet get to hold necessarily in their hands. Strong feelings of emptiness that were felt, as well as a lot of chaotic movement. Also interested in this study, was how men view their role during this process of healing from a miscarriage in their relationship with their female partners. So some of them felt that they had to be the rock. What does being a rock mean? That a lot of times, which falls within the stereotype of men, they have to keep it together. They have to hold back on their own emotions and their own grief in order to pay attention to their significant other, right? Their spouse. Same idea with the guard, same idea with the repairman wanting to fix the situation, not wanting their loved one to encounter the deep sense of sadness that sometimes is felt. And at the same time, feeling like a secondary character because all the attention is given to her rather to them. There is something called the perinatal grief scale that was developed years ago by two female psychologists who wanted to study the impact that couples had when faced with the pregnancy loss. And interestingly enough, it validated how all that immediate attention is given to her, her sense of sadness, her sense of loneliness, et cetera, et cetera. And because he is also giving attention to her healing, it's not until after the 2-year mark upon the death of that baby that now his feelings of despair start to kick in, because now she's doing better. And the sadness with men, even more so, is that there's less outlets for them to talk, right? That there's a stronger sense of, I have to be the tough one. I have to keep it together for my family and not embrace the different emotions, and which are really mixed, that they have. So this is an opportunity as lay ministers, as those of you become more curious to learn about training, about starting a program in your different parishes. How are we going to invite men? How are we going to gain the knowledge to understand that a pregnancy loss equally impacts them? Whether it's a grandpa, a sibling, an uncle, it doesn't matter. There has to be that mutual component of addressing both female and male in the loss. And I'm glad that the Rachel's Vineyard was mentioned, Deacon Ed, because they do a beautiful job of integrating couples into that weekend retreat where both of them can heal together. And I've witnessed it, and the Holy Spirit is so present in that intense weekend where you see the growth of that ability to heal from the wounds that are left, both from an abortion as well as a miscarriage. So different possibilities. Really, the creativity is up to any one of us to have the heart and the desire to want to embrace equally men and women in the healing of a pregnancy loss. Disenfranchised grief is the concept of not being able to acknowledge culturally a loss. And this is really what happens with a pregnancy loss, that it's treated as a non-event and individuals don't feel entitled to grieve. There's still a lot of misunderstanding and miseducation, as I was mentioning, about losses. So even with miscarriage, sometimes the common response are, oh, don't worry, you're young, you'll have another child. The loss gets dismissed. With an abortion, it's, well, you decided, why are you feeling so bad? Right? So there's that constant pattern of minimizing and not allowing for the space to be given to simply share a story. We're not talking about having them forget what happened. We're not going to justify, in the case of an abortion, the circumstances that happened, but we need to offer the safe space for folks to share the circumstances in which those losses took place, and their desire in a way to want to have a family, but in the right moment, in the right conditions for some for them. A biggest myth that I've experienced through the work that I've been doing over the years is not wanting to bring up a pregnancy loss in someone, even with miscarriage, because of the fear that we're going to make them feel sad or they're going to cry in front of us. That is a very natural emotion. It's a very natural response to want to protect someone that we know. But when we don't ask specifically, how are you doing with your loss? What can I do for you? We are contributing to that disenfranchisement. And that's why I bring it up. We are contributing to the stigma of, oh no, this is something that we cannot talk about. We make it a taboo. when it's the total opposite of what we need to do because of the strong sense of loneliness that people experience during this grief. To not acknowledge it contributes to the fact that it didn't happen, that nobody feels comfortable to talk about it. So I'm gonna, put this shell over me or hide underneath the blanket so that I try to contain it, which can lead to a lot of unhealthy behaviors. So an invitation here is to please, when you learn that someone's had a miscarriage, a stillbirth, when you learn that someone's struggling with infertility, even with an abortion, that it is healthy, it is good to ask them, how are you doing? Without the fear that they're going to feel sad or that they're going to cry. Crying is so helpful. It's so healthy to us. And a lot of times we misunderstand it. The same thing with the emotion of anger. Anger can be very healthy if used in the right way, but we turn it around as that it's such a bad thing. Well, yeah, it's bad if you're going to hit someone, but if you want to yell because you're frustrated that the doctor couldn't help you, or that you're mad at yourself because you think by you lifting, I don't know, the laundry basket, you caused that miscarriage. It is okay to be able to do that. And so we have to be that safe person that can listen and that can validate and honor those different feelings that have, rather than being afraid, oh, I'm going to make them feel worse. So I hope that that's a strong message that all of you can take with you as you hopefully try to start a ministry, or at least open yourselves to the opportunity to embracing to talk about pregnancy loss. Again, your job is not to diagnose them. Your job is not to, say you need this, you need the other. Your job is primarily to listen and to look for the possibilities of, a higher level of care for that individual. If you hear that someone after a pregnancy loss is really considering death, that's pretty severe. I would not hesitate to, call the respective 911 or significant other from that individual to let them know, this is what I'm hearing. This person needs added help. We're to be instruments of, added referrals and added resources for anyone that we come across. Now, mind you, this is a topic that can perhaps has impacted you on a personal level. So if this is a trigger for you, if you are revisiting your own personal loss, know that I'm happy to provide the space to also hear you out. And the referrals that I'm going to be giving you towards the end of this presentation also provide a healthy outlet for all of you to be able to share and communicate the memories of what has happened in order to help you further your healing. It's not uncommon that because of this disenfranchised grief, men and women have kept their story of pregnancy loss for years. And this is something that you may already be familiar with, but we've had men and women who after 30, 40 years have reached the hotline that I was in charge of to share their story. I remember clearly a woman in her 80s, very late stage in life, who already had her grown family. I believe she had 4 grown children, but she had also had 4 abortions. And although she felt that she had done a lot of the healing, this was the last step that she needed to do and talk to someone else about those abortions to feel that she was in a better place with God as she was hoping to enter heaven. And how beautiful that she had the insight to realize this is something that happened. It did not define me, but I want to do a little more work with regards to that. I also remember a gentleman who heard me talk in a radio station as we were promoting the ministry. And for 30 years, he hadn't shared that he had contributed to the abortions of 2 women. And he had a conversion story, but this was one missing aspect of his healing that he needed to do. And we strategized about how to go about doing that. And it brought a lot of comfort for him to know that there were these strangers across this phone line who he'll never meet, perhaps, who can provide that active listening ear and be a soundboard free of judgment that could help him with additional steps to healing. And that's the invitation for all of us. Were these 2 individuals struggling with mental health illness? Perhaps at some point in their life, but the bottom line is that they had a wound. And that wound hurt their relationship with themselves, and it hurt their relationships with God. And our job was to help create that bridge through a compassionate approach in helping them with their healing. So what is the Merciful Companion model that I created? So having some psychological background, I felt that it was important to spend a 2-day training and focusing the first day at least in more of an in-depth study of the mindset of someone who experiences a pregnancy loss. And the primary reason is to help raise our empathy and our compassion. Because let's face it, despite how good a Catholic we can be, there is judgment because of our sinful nature. So, and that's the biggest fear that a lot of people have, especially those who come from a religious background, the inability to share with loved ones who come from a religious pro-life background because they feel they're going to be shamed, they're going to be judged, and they're going to be sent to hell. It's not our job to judge anyone. That's God's doing. Obviously, as Catholics, we are going to recommend confession because we understand the nature of the sin. But regardless of that, we need to understand, well, what were the precursors? What were some of the reasons why an abortion took place, to raise our awareness of how to be more empathetic. What the impact of stillbirth does into someone. At the same time, I feel that it's important that all of us be equipped with some crisis management tools, because some folks who have a precursor of history of depression, and some people do share that from the very beginning, some people don't, but we may discover that in the conversations we have. We need to be able to assess for the possibility of suicidality and what to do. And at the same time, the program creates or provides these different tools to accompany those who hurt. And as you have been hearing me, a lot of it is based on the active listening, right? That accompaniment model of how do I hear, how do I reflect back the validation for their feelings, because you may be the only person, and in a lot of times you are, as it has happened to us, that learn the secret, that learn the different struggles that they've had. And remember that it's not going to be just women who are going to be calling, and young college women, perhaps, which tends to be the biggest stage that I've discovered where the majority of these losses take place. It could be anyone. It could be a grandparent. It could be a sibling who is trying to understand and work through the different mixed emotions that they're having. The manual or the model also contains these different topics, and any of you who decide to do further research, you will find that this is a very similar model to other models out there. In fact, I think it was the Archdiocese of Illinois who has a very similar model too. And you can see the importance of the sharing of their story, right? You are trying to build a connection, and if you're bombarding people with questions, you're interrupting their process of releasing a lot of the memories that our brain naturally wants to store in our brain and forget. And I'm not going to get into the whole how our brain works, because even to me, it's difficult to communicate. But I think all of us know, difficult experiences, whether they're traumatic or not, our brain does something to help us handle those difficult memories. And it's very common that in the case of pregnancy loss, sometimes even those memories will get repressed, or people want to work through things very quickly and say, when is this going to be over? I want to be my usual self. I want to be back to how I was before this loss. And the reality, as we use a grief model as well, is that you don't get to be who you were before, but you move forward in becoming a new self. Okay. But it comes through the sharing of their story and understanding some of that background and the reasons and circumstances that they were in when that pregnancy loss took place. It also consists of further exploration of feelings. So we do have specific questions that we ask related to that, as well as to helping them process the loss. I at least come psychologically from the model that William Warden created, the tasks of grieving. I find it that it's very positive, and we walk our callers as to how it is that they're grieving. And it doesn't surprise me, but it saddens me sometimes that they don't recognize that what they're experiencing is grief. And that a lot of it has to do because of the stigma, right? Because we're not providing the cultural expected places for them to talk about this type of loss. So when we state the simple statement of, I am sorry for your loss, it just, you can sense over the phone, which is how we've been doing the ministry, the sense of relief that comes over them because of the acknowledgement, the acceptance of what it is that I lost. Obviously, we work with the language that is given to us. If they have not been able to accept that the loss is of a child and they prefer to refer that loss as an it, that's part of the language that we're going to utilize until we can help them with that acceptance of what truly was lost. We also work through helping them recognize some unhealthy behaviors. And I talked briefly about an eating disorder or the use of substance abuse. Also being in unhealthy relationships that are abusive is another unhealthy behavior that sometimes happens. The self-sabotaging is something else that we can see. We want them to build supports. We want them to help recognize who else can you trust with your story, who else can you confide, perhaps not the full details of how the loss took place, but that can be someone that can go on a walk with you, for example, that is someone that can take you to mass, to a healing retreat of some sort. So that's part of one of the topics that we have with our callers. And finally, the steps into healing, which a lot of times means the memorializing for individuals. This is not a step-by-step. We will never exclusively start with the sharing of the story. Some people come with an agenda of, okay, I'm ready to memorialize my child. What do I do? Or I've noticed that I keep drinking and I think it's related to my loss. What do I do? We're always going to come from the approach of meeting individuals where they're at. Okay. And sometimes we didn't get to cover all 6 topics with our callers. Sometimes they only needed to be heard once and that's it. Sometimes we stayed for a longer period of time with our callers before they were transitioned to another level of care. And that is okay. So this model implies that there's going to be flexibility as we focus on the needs of the individual at the moment we have them over the phone. Again, at least because this is a phone-based service. And the Catholic faith through the Archdiocese of Los Angeles obviously is interwoven throughout. We try to understand what their concept of God is, and we help improve that relationship. And we do that in many ways. Confession is always the first referral that we provide our callers, but we also talk about that self-forgiveness and what does that look like and what prayers are there to help them, support them in that healing. Here's some basic information that you can all take with you. And these are basic standards. It's not exclusive to the Merciful Companion model, but these are things that we reiterate over and over because of sometimes our own uncertainty of, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to be of help. And again, although I'm sounding repetitive, I really want this to be ingrained with all of you, the ability to listen and to be silent, to be free of judgment, as even in our body language, as we're hearing some of the difficult circumstances, perhaps of that miscarriage or stillbirth or the abortion, to be able to reflect back to what we're hearing. I hear you say this was difficult. To let them know that they're not alone. And it does sound like a cliche, but it is so helpful for others to hear that because of the strong sense of isolation that comes from a pregnancy loss. You also want to give them hope, right? You want to thank them for sharing their story with you and provide them with any resources that you have for them to further that healing and invite them to be in touch with that. It can be a scary process, but when they know that someone's there to listen, they look forward to every week or whatever the frequency is of being able to connect with you because you're providing that unconditional, compassionate support to be present with them. At the same time, you can see the opposite of what not to do. the passing of judgment, the suggesting, this is the right way or the wrong way of doing things. Get over it. Comments like that are not going to be helpful. If you get a hunch that someone has had a pregnancy loss and not asking about it, you contribute to that disenfranchisement. So you want to really pray to have the courage to ask a question. And if you hear about their story, do your best not to dismiss it. If you promise you're going to get back to them, they hang on to that. So you want to be able to connect with them at a later time where perhaps you can give more of yourself to listen. And certainly never impose that they name their child. I think that that's a common myth. It can be helpful, but not everyone can come to terms of recognizing the gender or recognizing or providing a name for their child. Healing can still take place regardless of that. Will it be helpful? Absolutely, but we never want to impose. We want to invite them to consider it, but never come across as nagging, oh, how couldn't you name your child? Don't you know that was a baby type of thing? And I think you all get it. I know that I'm preaching to the choir on that. Okay, questions, comments. I hope I didn't go too fast. I'll take a little bit more time to talk about some of the resources that I have listed here. LifePerspectives.com is another organization that I work under the mental health clinician hat, where I teach other counselors on how to start work with clients that talk about their losses or how to elicit that information from them. And they, although it's a secular organization, they do have a component of a faith leaders toolkit that I invite all of you to take a look at. They do have grief care certifications as well, with different components of things that you can watch live or that you can try to attend in person, as well as previously recorded, that provide you with additional tools similar to what I've presented to you today. They also have an Everyone Toolkit, which is for family, friends, and loved ones on what to do with regard to this miscarriage and how to offer support. Supportafterabortion.com, I also mentioned them. They're a national association that provides a lot of resources, Bible related, religious affiliated, and none throughout the country. And they also have a lot of educational seminars and conferences that can provide additional information to get us all educated and grow in how we can continue to offer or start offering services to those who want to heal from these wounds. And Redbird.love is an organization of the loss of children and how to help those who have encountered the loss of children. I thought it's a Catholic-based organization. It's growing. It's really beautiful. So these are three that I personally tap into that I trust, that I wanted to share with the rest of you. Any thoughts or comments? I hope that I covered. Deaconette, if there's anything that I missed that you maybe want to help me bring about or that I can clarify, I'm open to talking it out.
That was great. Thank you, Sharon. I mean, the idea here is to open our minds a little bit up to other things that we can offer as part of a mental health ministry, and providing this sort of support. I mean, just by the nature of the folks that are involved with mental health ministry, tend to have some empathy and sympathy and listening skills. This is the sort of thing that does get passed over in many places. The need to comfort people and be compassionate and to provide that type of support to people that are suffering the trauma after either a pregnancy loss, a miscarriage, or for post-abortion. So it's something we can definitely integrate into our ministries for those folks that have an interest in it. I see there was one question at least about the statistics on on suicide. Those numbers that you saw there, 13 to 16, that's a rate per 100,000. So the population. So the number, obviously, when the population's smaller, the rates are a little bit. The total suicide deaths are lower when the population's smaller. But the rates here in the United States just have not changed that much in the last 100 years, sadly. Like I said, it goes up and down, but the rate per 100,000 is pretty much where it's been. So Can we download this presentation? There's another question here. Yeah, we'll certainly be putting the presentation, the webinar, up on our website, uh, the Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers website. So you'll be able to go there and take a look at it. Uh, let's couple comments here in the chat here.
Well, I can answer to this one, Deacon Ed, from
Okay,
Anna.
go ahead. Yeah.
So the folks that I have trained, they're lay people. They don't have a psychological background or training in mental health per se. These are just people who felt called to the ministry. Some of them did experience their own personal losses, pregnancy losses, which is not a requirement. In fact, the self-disclosure, the sharing of one's story of pregnancy loss doesn't necessarily take place unless needed. But because I was involved as a supervisor per se, I always had ongoing conversations with my merciful companions to keep them on the right track of that companionment. So I always heard the different stories, and the training was intensive for that particular reason, to provide them and equip them with enough tools that they felt competent to individually offer those phone conversations with folks, and then we would debrief together. So I've been the only licensed clinician, and the folks who joined were people with compassionate hearts who felt the need. And mind you, a lot of what we're trying to do when we help heal any individual from the wound of a pregnancy loss, especially when it comes to abortion, the chances of them not having another abortion reduces. Okay, the impact of the mental health, their ability to be able to cope with the pain, leads them to heal, so that in the future they become that successful story to talk to someone who might be considering an abortion, for example, not to do it because of the psychological impact that they have. So a program like this is very, very beneficial for that particular reason as well. And remember that this applies to men as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, this question here asks whether trained lay people or degrees in mental health sciences of some kind. And that's a point that we make over and over in this mental health ministry is that we're not mental health care practitioners, we're not clinicians, therapists, we're ministers. And really at the heart of mental health ministry is evangelization, bringing the love of Christ into the lives of people who live with these illnesses or suffer from these traumas, and those that care for them. So what we are is ministers, and hopefully bring the presence of Christ through our ministry into the lives of people who suffer from these things.
Absolutely, Deacon Ed. And looking at some of the other questions that they have here, our knowledge also has to be in terms of what are those other resources and what is outside of what we can do, right? And even myself as a licensed clinician, I can't help everyone. I'm not an expert in all the different aspects of mental health, but I can become aware within the city of the individual of where I can send them for professional help. A lot of it has to do with tapping into their own insurance, medical insurance, which tends to cover mental health and lead them in that direction. In terms of the sacrament of confession, I am particular of the priests that we send our folks to confess. And that's because unfortunately, not every priest is very compassionate. Yes, they will give the sacrament of confession, but it has not always come out across in a compassionate way. It has come across with a judgmental way. And I've heard that in some of the stories of women and men who've gone to confession. So there's a need to increase the training for priests. And I know that there's organizations to do that. I think Life Perspectives is one of them. And within the Archdiocese, I know that at least deacons were being trained in how to increase their empathy and their knowledge. We know that our pastors, our priests are very overwhelmed with the different duties that they have, but there are several who have taken upon growing in knowledge of how to work with men and women who have an abortion, for example, and really lead them to healing. And even they themselves refer them to Rachel's Vineyard Retreat, for example, or they have sent them our way to the Merciful Companion. So we have to be careful of what priests we send them to, because it's not your average confession on a Saturday afternoon or whenever it's given where this should take place. It's really more of a private one-on-one appointment.
Right. That's a good point to keep in mind. We've all heard stories from people that have gone to confession. Of course, they got the grace of the sacrament, but
Mhm.
maybe came out of it not getting everything they needed, I guess, in some ways, from an empathetic point
Mhm.
of view. Yeah, I see one question here, a comment from Rachel about continuing to accompany people once they get professional care. Hopefully, they do get the professional care they need, but to realize that we're mind, body, and soul, so they continue to need spiritual care even when they're getting hopefully good medical and professional mental health care. There's sadly, all too often when folks are in mental health care, the spiritual side of their lives get uh, uh, ignored in worst cases. So that's what we're here as mental health ministers, is to try to
Mhm.
reassure them that they're, I don't care what the mental illness is or trauma is, abortion, even trauma after an abortion, the church is still open, the church is still welcome, and the church still wants
Mhm.
to comfort and console them through prayer too, because Christ is the
Absolutely.
best psychologist, psychiatrist out there. Certainly understands in a deep, compassionate way what the suffering all of us go through. Uh, and you know what? And let me see if there's any more. I see there's a couple
There
questions
are
here.
two questions actually for Sharon. One of them
Okay.
is, do you offer your training outside of LA?
Oh, Deacon Ed, we talked about this, huh? Um, at this moment, I don't, but I'm open to talking with you. If you want to send me your email and see how we can connect, since I'm no longer with the Archdiocese, that's a program that they are taking on in different ways, although I remain as a consultant for training purposes. But we can certainly talk about, how we can get together. Life Perspectives does offer, a training program, so you may want to tap into them and see if at least your initial needs can be met that way. But if you're looking for the specific merciful companion model, we would have to talk and work it out through the Archdiocese to see how we can make it happen.
And then the second question is, does a church ever baptize a fetus before burial?
I'm not the ultimate expert. My understanding is no. The baby has to be born for baptism. It has to be right outside the womb for baptism.
In terms of that, though, I think the significant comes at least what I'm understanding is, where is my baby, right? And trying to find solace in knowing where the child is. And that's when the memorializing aspect can come. And depending on the stage of life within where that death took place, there's some cemeteries that are open to creating rituals and services that can help. I don't know if it entails some spiritual baptism or not, but I think the key component here is knowing where my child is and having a sense of being able to say goodbye, which we know is difficult when it comes to a pregnancy loss, depending on the stages in which that took place.
That's absolutely right. These rites of grieving and of mourning are so important, that people have them made available to them, that they can. That's a big part of grieving, is mourning well, is the phrase that's sometimes used.
It's
Let's
certainly
see. I think
something
we
to
have time for
explore a little
one.
bit further. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a comment here about blessings. Yeah, blessings, those sort of things are different than the sacrament of baptism. So yes, there could be there's a comment here, could a blessing occur at the time of an infant's death? And yes, there's all sorts of blessings, but there's 7 sacraments, and the sacrament of baptism is my understanding is always at the moment when there's life outside the womb.
The beauty of our Catholic faith is embracing loss with no judgment and with Christ's compassion. We see Christ in those that are grieving, those that are suffering.
Right.
And I can't think of really a better way to help lead them in that renewed relationship with themselves as well as with God. And before I forget, Kate, I'm hoping that you'll send out the link for a brief evaluation of today, at least as it pertains to my presentation.
Yes, as you leave the webinar today, you'll be prompted to answer a quick survey, and then those answers will be generated back to us, and then we can share them with Sharon.
And I think that's it. We're at the end of our hour. So we appreciate everyone checking in, and we'll be doing this on a monthly basis with different topics that we think would be of interest to those of you that are interested in and are participating in mental health ministries in your parish. So thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in a month or so.
Thank you
Have a
so
good
much.
day.
God bless. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.